y'all, it's Omleet, bringing you a tier list discussion video. Back on the heels of a balanced patch, 2 weeks now it's been, and I'm feeling a lot more confident about where the unit standings are. Now, that being said, some units are going to change over time as the meta is still developing, but I think that I'm feeling a lot more confident. And also, recommend that you check out Blade's discussion on the tier list videos. Probably going to come out here at the end of the month, maybe a little bit later. Does a very good job of comprehensively looking at all the units and figuring out where they belong in the tier list. And of course, also check out Great Boy Gaming. He did a tier list video and it's pretty good as well. So jumping right in here, we have Missile Troopers as the first change. So Missile Troopers moved all the way from B tier on GDI to S tier, and this is because Chuggy isn't as effective at removing them anymore. Chuggy used to drop all these clouds and kill all your Missile Troopers. Now you can effectively duel Chuggy with your Missile Troopers by making 2 sets, floating a Pitbull behind, and maybe you have an anti-infantry unit to support. So because of this, Missile Troopers are going to dictate the tempo of the meta. I think that any deck that can't answer Missile Troopers is going to struggle in this metagame, and for that reason I believe Missile Troopers are S tier. Pitbull is a pretty solid and versatile pick. It is a really good complement to pretty much any deck, and it's S tier for that reason. Moving on to A tier, we have Snipers. Snipers have been A tier for the last several patches, but they're very sweaty and try hard to play, and if you're not good at preserving models on them, they're probably closer to C tier. But if you are good at preserving models on them by confounding your opponent, moving your units back and forth, and making them take the worst pathing to attack your snipers, they're a very good unit for accruing value and getting ahead in the game. So for this reason, Snipers are A tier, but be advised, not a very easy unit to play. Dogs, a very strong unit for winning the first missile, and they're cheap for good for saving the money in the bank and coming out ahead later on in the game. So for this reason, Dogs, solid A tier pick. You're going to win a lot of first missiles if you're good at leveraging their early game advantage. I'm keeping Predator Tank in the A tier because I believe that it is very good into the coming meta. We're seeing a resurgence of APC, and also Nod relies a lot on Scorpion Tank as a staple in many of its decks. Predator is good against both of these units. Also, McNeil was buffed, and if you run McNeil with Predator, you have a much easier time answering Giga and MLRS. And even if you don't run McNeil, those units are finding a little bit harder, I believe, in the meta to kind of work out. You can bait shots with your missile squads and move your Predators in that way, and use the missile squads to finish off like Giga or whatever that might have countered your Predator in the past. So Predator, very solid pick. Borca is one of GDI's strongest units. It's very fast, maneuverable, can flip pads, can quickly remove a lot of different War Factory units, harvesters, and it's also very strong at just taking off infantry models. So if you don't have a good target for your Orca, it's just a very good unit to do something on the battlefield with. And for that reason, it's a solid A pick, one of GDI's strongest units. The latest addition to A tier are Shockwave and Razorback, and I think in the coming meta, you're going to really want strong and diverse anti-infantry options to answer lasers and missiles, which are going to be defining the meta and the tempo of the game. If you're able to force your opponent to switch what units are using to protect their lasers, you're effectively able to change the tempo of the battle. And so I think having multiple strong anti-infantry units is going to be key to coming out ahead in the meta to come. So Shockwave's very strong unit, pretty maneuverable for infantry, and they were indirectly buffed because a lot of their answers were nerfed. Chuggy nerfs allow you to bring Pitbull Shock and challenge the Chuggy. Inferno Reload and movement speed nerfs allow you to protect your shocks a little bit more easily, hunt those Infernos down. And Giga, not conventional answer to infantry, but it was pretty good at just clearing all ground units. And those nerfs combined essentially make shocks a lot better in the current meta. Now Razorback was already a strong unit, but it's a lot easier to preserve it now because they buffed it against Phantom, able to survive a full Phantom volley, and also because missiles are a meta-defining unit and they pair so well with Razorback. Razorback is in the A tier now. It is one of the meta-defining units, and it's going to be very strong if you're able to preserve your Razorback and harass your opponent with your units while maintaining your economy. So moving on to B tier, we have Rifles. Pretty good early game units. However, I think that it falls off a little bit mid to late game, but since it's so cheap, it's not that big of a deal. It gives you the flexibility to switch to other units. Solid B tier unit. So Machine Gun Squad, very polarizing, very good on some maps and into some matchups, but I think with the buffs to Rhino, Shatterer, Razorback, and not a very good unit in those matchups. And also some matchups it's A tier, other matchups it's C or D tier. Don't recommend running this unit, but if it's your jam, yeah, moving on. Slingshot. Slingshot, pretty good pair with Sniper. It is a solid mid-ranged anti-air unit, but I think that because of the nature of Borca and Inferno, it kind of struggles against those two units. Your mileage may vary depending on the use case scenario of it, so pretty good at protecting your snipers against Razorback, but you know, it's kind of map dependent, kind of clunky to play. APC is a very solid B tier unit as well. I think with the nerf to Inferno, it's a little bit more playable, and also the buff to Strong Arm, solid pick to bring with it. Now, it may be a tank meta, so you might struggle to make APC work. Remains to be seen, but I think APC pretty solid in this meta overall, and may even be very good with McNeil. Requires a little bit of testing there. Hammerhead is a very good pick. I think that it's a solid answer. You're heavy into the War Factory, particularly against like Borca, Inferno. Even Orca, I think GDI struggles a little bit removing Orca in some ways, and Hammerhead might be a good pick there as well. MLRS, I think, fell from A tier somehow, paradoxically, even though they nerfed Chuggy, which was like one of the biggest counters to MLRS. I think that the buff to McNeil makes MLRS very hard to play in that matchup, and also I think MLRS, it seems people are just better at baiting its shots. I don't know, like, if you're very good at like predicting your opponent, being one step ahead of them, preserving your shots when you need to, but you know, sometimes it's okay to just let it fire wherever, it's still a good unit. It's just kind of hard to play in certain matchups. Drone Swarm went from A tier to B tier in my opinion. This is twofold. One is, you know, there's going to be more missiles and lasers overall. I think these are pretty good answers to Drone Swarm. And also, I think that the buff to Banshee is making Drone Swarm a little bit harder to play, where it shined against Nod. You know, generally speaking, Drone Swarm was not very good against GDI. Pitbull Shocks just chewed them up easily, and Nod kind of struggled because the bikes were a little bit inconsistent, so you could just flood Drone Swarms all the time. But with the buff to Banshee, I think that Drone Swarm is going to be a little bit harder to play and keep control of the map using them. Mohawk, I'm a little bit iffy on this one. I have it in B tier right now. I think that it pairs decently with McNeil, and the meta may be a little bit more ripe for it, particularly because you're able to bring more missiles out and not be worried about your Chuggies countering those missiles. So Mohawk may be a little bit more playable, but you know, it's not very good against Stealth Tank, and I think Stealth Tank is doing better this patch, so I think play with this one, check it out, see if you like it. Maybe B tier, maybe C tier, we'll see. Borca, I think, received a buff overall, but the buff, you know, doesn't necessarily make it more usable in a lot of the use case scenarios. You know, it's not a deck defining unit. It is a unit that is very good at supporting your other units. So if your deck is weak to a specific unit, like Giga for example, Borca was really good against those units, and now it's even better against those units. And Borca isn't as bad against Slingshot anymore either, because it just instantly snipes it. But overall, I'd say that the change was probably neutral. You know, it made it reload a little bit faster. It made it a little bit easier to kill units very quickly with it, but also it comes at the cost of maybe you're going to bomb your own units. Maybe you can't chase units as effectively because you're out of range and the bombs are dropped by the time you reach it. You know, there are new problems that have risen with the change to Borca. So overall, I'd say it's a good change, but it's different. You know, it's still roughly B tier. Grenadier is buffed overall. I'd say it went from C tier to B tier. It's a solid pick. Basically, it roots your army. It can tank a lot of different damage. Not much more to say about it. You know, it's a solid pick. Chuggy nerfs also made it a little bit more viable overall. Shatterer, I think this one's a bit contentious. A lot of people seem to think Shatterer is terrible. I think that because of the buff to missiles, you can actually get away with spamming like 2 missiles, a Shatter, and a Pitbull, and you can force people to have to answer you. So I think that Shatter is actually a very solid pick. I've had pretty good success with it. You know, my win rate isn't the best with it right now because I'm bad, but I feel like the unit is actually doing pretty well overall. So I think as more people experiment with it, they may see that it is actually a decent unit overall. Rhino, I think, is okay. You know, I think the problem with Rhino is that it's not a very good answer to Mutant or Grenadier, and if you end up in that matchup, you may find yourself falling behind. And also, because it might be a tank meta, Rhino is really bad into tanks. So overall, I'd say like it got a buff, yes, but I think it's somewhere in between C and B tier. You know, like it's playable. It's very good if it has like a level advantage, but overall, you know, I wouldn't rely on this unit. If you're able to maybe make it work with MLRS and find some way to counter like mutants while keeping your Rhino alive, it may be good. It may be that, you know, without Liang, Rhino is just not very good. So remains to be seen. I think Talon fell into C tier, and this is a lot of different reasonings, but essentially because Banshees are better able to duel Talons, and Talons have never really been good at fighting lasers or missiles, and those units are becoming more prevalent. I think that Talon is basically a jack of all trades that doesn't really excel at anything, and for that reason I have it in C tier. You know, it's not really something you can really rely on. It's versatile, you might be able to find a use for it in your deck, and it's somewhat dependable, but at the same token, you know, you can also just lose control of the map by playing Talons because they're so fragile. So for that reason, C tier. MSV was already in D tier. I think that essentially Shatterer is something that you had to play with MSV, and it was really hard to kind of protect your MSV from mutants and grenadiers and shade. So MSV has just always kind of been D tier for that reason, but the change I feel was basically made it even less playable. You know, there's some weird fringe decks you could play where you like basically poked your Predator tank in, and ultimately I think the MSV change, while not really that impactful because that deck wasn't really that good to begin with, it still was probably a net decrease overall, but still, you know, D tier. All tech is just D tier because it's hard to get online, and then I think Jump Jet Troopers were basically they cost too much to be fielded, you know, compared to Missile Troopers. Basically you're paying twice as much for effectively the same unit, and now that they don't jump, I think they're even worse. Like, you know, I had them in B tier before because you could cheese missiles, but you know, now I have them all the way down in D tier. Now moving on to commanders, I think that there's been quite a bit of a shift here. McNeil went from C tier to S tier, and the reason for this is not necessarily because it's broken in every single matchup, but I think it's still a win more commander where if you have a lead against your opponent and they're trying to fight their way onto the pad, you can just drop them down and then you're pretty much effectively guaranteed to win the missile. Also, McNeil is just better into random matchups. Like if there's a 2-range unit like a sniper, an MLRS, a Giga, or something along those lines, it's just really good at being able to allow you to push into those formations and force your opponents to have to move their units away. So McNeil, very solid pick overall, and I think that he's kind of effectively shaping the meta in certain ways. But I don't think he's the best commander in every single scenario. Sometimes it's more effective to just have Jackson or Strongarm, but overall I'd say that McNeil is probably going to help you in areas where you are needing help the most, compared to, you know, like Jackson or Strongarm, who are just solid picks overall and, you know, constantly keep you ahead. McNeil may, you know, shift things that are unwinnable more in your favor more consistently. So Strongarm got a buff. I think she's just more consistent overall. I think she's probably a worse McNeil, but she's more consistent in more scenarios, so you may want to pick her. Jackson is just a very solid pick for, you know, doing a lot of different things. I think basically you bring Jackson over McNeil if you need to get units in position more effectively. For example, I think Jackson pairs better with Borca than it does with McNeil, and I think Jackson also pairs better with Predator, a little bit better than McNeil overall, but McNeil just may be better in the situations I outlined above, you know, where you're in an unwinnable situation and you need something different to shake up what your opponent's doing. And then Solomon, I think, is still solid B tier. I think that Solomon is better against McNeil than Jackson or Strongarm, because if you were losing against McNeil and you have Solomon, you may be able to affect the pads in a different way. You basically just ion the McNeil trap instead of trying to push in, and the ion isn't affected by McNeil. So in that scenario, Solomon's a little bit better, but overall I'd say he's basically the same. You know, he struggles a little bit in being affordable, and you know, he's maybe OP in some situations, but a lot of the time, you know, he can be a dud. If you miss with him, you're probably going to lose the game. Now Liang went from D tier. You know, he was maybe playable in some matchups, so maybe he was even C tier in some matchups with like Peter's Borca Predator deck. I think he went from like D tier to like below D tier, and then Battering Ram also I forgot to mention below D tier. Basically, these are units that you're making them and you're probably lowering your chance of winning the game. Just the restrictiveness of Liang, they crippled him, so unfortunate. So moving on to Nod, we're going to see a few similarities, so we might fly through this, but essentially Missile Squad, lasers, they're very analogous because of the chuggy nerfs. They're meta-defining units, very flexible, and they keep you able to build different units, and they're just strong backbone of pretty much any army, so we have them in S tier. Bikes are a meta-defining unit. Just make bikes, you know, one of the strongest units in the game. I think the change was probably a very, very, very minor nerf. Sometimes a third shot doesn't get off. It can be the difference in like a matchup like an Orca being killed or not being killed. But overall, I'd say they perform about the same as they did. They seem to even overkill squads about the same as they did. Now, there might be a directional component to this. Like if they're facing to the right side of the map, they may be more consistent than if they're facing to the left. Not entirely sure, maybe imagining that, but yeah, be on the lookout for that, I guess. I don't know. A tier, we have Wheels, a very solid anti-infantry unit. As I said before, anti-infantry seems to be really important in this meta, and it pairs pretty well with Flames. Chuggy, I think, got nerfed. It's definitely a lot worse against Mutants, against Grenadiers. It doesn't do as well into the tank matchup. You're able to basically protect your tanks even with, you know, militants, because it can't drop those clouds as effectively and melt the militants away. So essentially, Chuggy is definitely doing worse, but I think it's still a solid pick, and if you were able to pair it with, essentially I think Nod needs to bring like 3 anti-infantry units to be able to shore up some of its weaknesses, but I think it's still a solid pick overall. It's just not going to be as meta-defining and warping as it was before. Scorpion is a well-rounded anti-vehicle unit. I think it's probably the most well-rounded unit in the game in that regard, and it's just a solid pick in any deck. Very good into APC, so enough said there. Inferno is nerfed. It's a lot harder to play. It's more clunky, and it's not as, you know, definitively winning when you get the Inferno online. You can still lose, and it's a little bit hard to get to it. So I still tentatively have it in A tier right now. It could be in B tier, but I think that its general strength against pretty much all ground units makes it a solid A tier pick. It's just a lot harder to play. You basically have to have a unit blocking for it, or else it's going to be gunned down by like bikes or pit bulls chasing it because of that movement speed nerf. Also, the movement speed nerf makes it so you can't be as aggressive with it and push it onto the back pad after it's fired. You used to be able to just like immediately boost it and then move it onto that back pad, but now it's a little bit harder because it's not as maneuverable. Now, joining the other units in A tier. So Flames, like Shocks, are in A tier because they challenge lasers and missiles pretty well, and they're pretty easy to play, pretty straightforward. Banshees, very surprising change. I am so stoked with how it works. It's so cool. The Banshee goes in, it's got this raider ability, it can chase down air units. It's very good at chasing down air units now. I think this was a huge usability improvement for Banshee, and I'm interested to see what kind of decks it fits into, but I think the unit is a lot more flexible now. And you can even do this cute little cheeky poke maneuver where you like come in, poke the unit, go out, come in, poke the unit for more damage, do a little bit of chip damage on that unit, and it can really, there's such a high skill floor, or high skill ceiling I should say, on Banshee now. It's such an interesting and cool change that they made here. So very excited to see how this shapes out in the meta. I have it in A tier. Stealth Tank is a very good unit. I think that Phantom being a little bit worse against Razorback has essentially made Stealth Tank climb up into the A tier, and it's just, you need some sort of burst unit essentially to remove air, in my opinion, in this meta, especially if you're going up against like Borca or you're going up against like Razorback. You're going to want something that can quickly remove those units, so for that reason I have it in A tier, probably a solid pick in a lot of decks. Moving on to B tier here, we have Rifles, same, or Militants, same reason as Rifles. Early, they're really strong. Mid to late, kind of fall off. Chem Warriors, they are a solid pick. I think that they complement Kane pretty well because they can set up clouds and stuff, and then Kane can fill in the holes for anti-infantry that you're missing. And they're just a very tanky, beefy boy. They're a little bit slow, so you probably want to run them with Rifles overall because it's hard to transition. But essentially, I think they're in a pretty solid state overall. Mutants are pretty good. I'd say that the nerf of Chuggy helped Mutants, but overall it also hurt them because they paired very well with Chuggy. So it's a solid pick. It's just that Nog kind of struggles at removing infantry as a result of the Chuggy nerf. So essentially, Mutants, B tier. Buggy is a very solid pick. I think that it gives Nod a diverse answer to like infantry into drone swarm spam, and basically it can kind of throw GDI for a loop if it's relying on that drone swarm spam to win a missile early, because the Buggy is good against both the infantry and the drone swarm, and then you can have the lasers kind of back you up against the Orca, whereas I feel Bike is a little bit unfavored in that early tech switch because it has a hard time removing the drone swarms, and it's not very good against the Rifles either. So For that reason, I have Buggy in B tier compared to Rhino, which is in C tier for GDI, even though Rhino is probably the more effective stat unit. Tick Tank is very good against Predators, and I think this is something that Not is missing, and as more people experiment with Tick Tank, it may find itself in an A tier. Essentially, if you can find a deck that is able to leverage the Tick Tank, I think that'll be very good. I like to run Tick Tank with like Jade to kind of remove some of the answers that are good against it. For example, I think Tick Tank is really bad against Giga, but if you have Jade, you can remove Giga, or you could use Kane as an example. This has been a classic combo. I think that's probably the most classic combo is Kane to remove like Giga or anything that's able to threaten the Tick Tank. And if you're able to get those Tick Tanks into position, they are very difficult to remove. So I think it's a solid B tier pick. Now Venom, Shade, and Phantom are all pretty good. Essentially, they are not quite good enough to remove whatever they're supposed to be removing. For example, Venom has a hard time against Shock Pitbull. So for that reason, I have it in B tier. Shade, same deal. It's kind of struggles against Pitbull. And then Phantom is still really good. You know, basically I like to bring out Phantom at the end of a missile to kind of flip the missile tempo and surprise my opponent by quickly removing an answer. And generally they may do the same thing. They might bring out an air unit. And so Phantom is this fastest unit that you can sneak onto the pad real quick and do that. Still pretty good unit, but because of the Razorback health buff, it's a little bit worse, I'd say, overall, but still solid B tier. Now, Giga fell from A tier to B tier because for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's easier to just push lasers in against it. So if the opponent or the person playing Giga isn't good at protecting their Giga and constantly keeping it surrounded and keeping it protected on all sides and blocked, then it's not going to be good enough to remove those lasers, and it's going to get overwhelmed and fall behind. It's also very map dependent now because, well, it was map dependent before, but it's even more so because if the map is like really wide open, it's easier to flank the Giga, and the Giga can't defend itself because it doesn't have like absurd infantry damage. And then finally, the buff to McNeil just made Giga absolutely dumpster tier against McNeil. McNeil forces the Giga to have to move, and if it stands in the McNeil trap, it effectively does 0 damage. So huge changes for Giga here. I'd say that it's B tier, is possibly C or D tier as well, but into certain matchups like MG Squad, I think that it can be kind of oppressive, so we've kind of left it in B tier for the time being. Now moving on to C tier, I think Fnatic's got a little bit of a buff here. The movement speed is welcome. It helps a lot of different units like Laser Pair with it. I think it's more playable than it was, but I still say that it's worse than Flames. Generally, you want a solid answer to the lasers and missiles, and I think the Fnatics are falling a little bit short of that. So for that reason, I have it in C tier. Scavengers are just a strictly worse laser. You can maybe, like against, basically if you're playing against a much worse player, they're better than lasers, but generally speaking, your opponent is not going to be much worse, and also it's going to incentivize your opponent to pop cap you. So for this reason, I really dislike Scavengers and have them in C tier. Laser drones are okay sometimes. You know, you can punk any player with light arrow and you can steal any missile, but the problem is they're very inconsistent, they're very fragile, and they're liable to get pop capped. So in situations like that, it can be very difficult to win the missile, and for that reason I have them in C tier. But they're kind of good for staying cheap and cheating out tech. So if you want to run tech like these, maybe consider laser drones. And finally, we have Flame Tank and we have Artillery. These are very strong units if you can get them out, but the problem is getting them out. You generally sacrifice a lot of tempo early game, and you sacrifice a lot of control. So these are very strong oversetted units. Nod is kind of struggling with the anti-infantry. If you can find a way to reliably get Flame Tank out and have a strong deck, it may be worth considering running it, but not entirely sure here. I think that essentially these tech style decks, they always struggle against like one unit, like Pitbull or something, just, you know, something very common, something very dumb that makes it hard to reach the tech and win the game. Now, joining C tier here, we have Scarabs, which I think were in D tier before. The health buff makes it so that they can essentially trade with a lot of different units now that they couldn't before. But the drawback is that they still cost 40. So, you know, if your opponent's running like 10 cost units into them, they're still going to be bad economic trades. But they're still better than they were, you know, like I'd say they're playable against a bad player. They're just going to run high cost units into them over and over. You're going to get a lot of value, but against like a really good player, they're probably going to be able to exploit them. And the other issue with Scarab is they're not very good at protecting a pad, particularly if they're left on one model. A good player can essentially just walk their unit into the pad and flip the pad at the last second. Now, the benefit of the health buff is now you can actually kind of circumvent that, and you can just block the pad with your Scarab. Whereas before, if you moved your Scarab and it had 100, you had half as much health, it just died instantly. So now you can actually kind of block with it. So it's a little bit better now. I have it in C tier as a result. Now, Catship got a buff. I think that it is a lot better against lasers and missiles. The problem is that it's too expensive to get online. By the time you have it online, your opponent is going to have something that is a hard answer to it in addition to lasers and missiles, and you're going to fall behind as a result. So I think the Catship is more playable than it was. I had it in like D tier before, but I still think that it is missing something that is required to make it a really good unit. Now, I could be mistaken on this. I think it pairs pretty well with Scorpion, just raidering the Scorpion underneath the Catship to kind of protect it from like Stealth Tank, Pitbull, bikes. These are all good things, and then the Catship protects the Scorpion from like lasers and other stuff like that. But there could be some trouble. You know, it's just kind of an expensive combo to get online, and it's still probably a little bit unfavored overall, I'd say. Now in Below Trash, we have all these tech units for obvious reasons. It's just hard to get them online. You're sacrificing a lot of consistency in your early game. They're overpowered if you can get them online. Like if you have like a Basilisk surrounded by cyborgs, obviously it's going to beat pretty much anything on a closed pad map where all the pads are close together, but you know, it's really hard to get it online. So this reason, all these units are in D tier. They're just super inconsistent. Now for commanders, I would say there's a huge shakeup in the commanders. The Oksana was in S tier before because she paired so well with Chuggy, Inferno, and Stealth Tank. Just having 3 units that were all in the same deck, and the fact that Oksana was super versatile and cheap allowed you to basically be flexible in all these units, made her really good. But all 3 of these units, well, except Stealth Tank, these 2 units, Inferno and Chuggy, got nerfed. So Oksana kind of lost a lot of value there. Also, Giga was nerfed, so Oksana lost value there. She's still a solid pick, and she's very consistent, but there are some maps that I think she's worse on than others, and this is particularly compared to her compatriots Seth and Kane. And the reason I say this is because Seth is really good on certain maps like Middle Oasis, where you're not able to drop Kane down, and you need to be able to hit that back pad and challenge it some way, and having that extra pop cap really makes Seth a very strong commander. He could potentially be an S tier on certain maps. On certain maps, he is just so strong, it is very hard to out-tempo him. I'm finding this to be a problem a lot, particularly with my weird, quirky Shatterer deck, is that people will drop down a Seth Bond, and even though I have Shatterer, you know, next to that pad or whatever, it's too hard to remove 6 units all at once on the pads. It's just, there's too much tempo required. It's too much of a tempo loss. So for that reason, I think Seth is a very strong commander right now. And then I would say Kane is also a very strong commander, especially if you can bait like a McNeil trap, or if you're weak to like Predator or something. Kane is something that you would want to bring. If you don't have an answer to Predator, Kane is probably going to be your boy, just because you're going to need something to protect your deck from Predators, unless you're really good at overwhelming your opponent with bike spam plus some sort of War Factory unit. And then finally we have Jade. I think Jade went from D tier to B tier. I think she's just a lot more predictable of a commander overall, and this makes her a lot more playable. She can remove certain answers that are like hard entrenched. For example, MG, she can remove Giga Cannons. It's a little bit easier even to pull off the Jade Catalyst Explosion using Chem Warriors. So I think she went from, you know, a D tier commander to B tier. She's a lot more playable in that regard, just because she's a more consistent removal tool. But I'd say that there's still the potential to delete your own army. That's why I had her in D tier before. You could delete your own army and it would cost you the game. I haven't done that yet. I've actually had a lot of good results with her, and I think she's a solid B tier commander as a result. She may be in C tier, remains to be seen, but I'd say that she is pretty solid and dependable now that she is connecting more consistently. So that does it for the tier list. And so a bit of a bonus meme here. We're going to talk about why JJT, or now JT, is a terrible unit. And the reason is, if you compare it to Missile Squad, it's very obvious. Missiles are only 20 cost, half the cost of Jump Jet Trooper, but they provide effectively the same amount of health. They provide, while they have different amounts of damage, I think that Missile Squad damage a little bit worse overall. They can shoot air, so they're a lot more flexible, and they both 2-shot bikes, which is something that you're kind of using them to do a lot of the time in your deck. So effectively, they fulfill the exact same role, but you're paying twice as much. The only benefit is you're just getting fastest speed on the Jump Jet Trooper, and they perform slightly better against Buggy, Rhino, and Shatterer. but you're still losing on value anyway. So you generally don't want to be running this. Like, these are losing matchups for your Jump Jet Trooper anyway. So where's the Jumpu, guys? What the heck was going on there? But yeah, overall I'd say that Jump Jet Trooper probably not worth running anymore, and that's why I have it in the D tier, even worse than, you know, Scavenger versus Lasers. I just think that it is a net cost to run it, even with the weird MSV bug that's going on with it. So just wanted to point that one out. Bonus meme for you if you stuck around. And thank you all for watching the video. It was fun, and I hope you are enjoying the patch as much as I am. See you on the battlefield. Take it easy.